Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. Buenos días, damas y caballeros. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sung-Hoon Kim, and I'd like to welcome all of you to the International Civil Aviation Organization's 40th Assembly SkyTalks. During a 2-week period, we have 68 presentations for you. I'm sure that you've seen many of them, but if you have missed anything, please make sure to visit the ICAO channel on YouTube for more information. Today we're going to talk about the fastest growing sector of the aviation, civil aviation, which is more to do with drone, RPAS, and UTM. The title of today's presentation is Unmanned Aviation, Addressing Emerging Challenges to Support Safe Development. And our presenter is Frédéric Malaud, Technical Officer of Drone RPAS. Please welcome Frédéric Malaud.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. It's a great pleasure and an honor for me to walk you through this short presentation about unmanned aviation. I just want to clarify from the outset that this is not intended to be a comprehensive or detailed overview of all regulatory or operational developments relating to unmanned aviation. It's more intended to be an overview of some salient challenges and developments regarding the unmanned aviation industry. So the presentation will cover 3 parts. First, we're going to talk about new aircraft, and then have a little some developments about the use cases that are handled and developed through the use of unmanned aircraft. And finally, we'll talk about the challenges associated to the introduction of unmanned aircraft into the aviation system. The reason why the first part is important, to clarify that this is about aircraft, is because as you hear and as you see probably every day, there is a proliferation of different terms used to address these developments. There is talk about drones, RPAS, UAV, UAS, and most of the time in a somehow interchangeable way. So the purpose of the presentation would be to clarify that first and foremost we are talking about aircraft. And the good news is, because we're talking about aircraft, we're already had the benefit of an existing framework which was developed by ICAO and is still being developed, and that helps really understand and have a good idea about how to tackle the challenges that are coming up. So first part, unmanned aircraft are aircraft. What is an aircraft? An aircraft is, simply speaking, and as most of you know, a machine that derives its support in the atmosphere from the reactions of the air. That is a simple definition, and that points to aerodynamic lift. That is the fundamental principle for aircraft, and most use cases, be it small unmanned aircraft, commonly referred to as drones, larger unmanned aircraft, or even the so-called flying taxis, they all use these principles. They all use the reactions of the air to sustain themselves in the atmosphere. What is an unmanned aircraft? An unmanned aircraft is described as an aircraft that is intended to be operated with no pilot on board. With no pilot on board, which means that such aircraft can be in many instances are operated with a pilot or a remote pilot that is not on board, that is either on the ground or in another aircraft. That is very important definition. On the graph, on the slide, you can see what is included in unmanned aircraft. On the graph here, you can see the quadrant. There is a to the right, small unmanned aircraft, the ones commonly referred to as drones. Those are the ones that generally weigh less than 25 kilograms. But unmanned aircraft, as just defined and described, also include unmanned free balloons, model aircraft that are used essentially for recreational purposes. And the fourth category, labeled here RPA, remotely piloted aircraft. Those are usually the largest ones that are operated by a remote pilot. And I want to mention that a subset of this category, a subset of remotely piloted aircraft, is the one that is intended to be integrated into a non-segregated airspace, and for which ICAO is developing standards, procedures, and guidance material through the RPAS panel. That is the category that corresponds to the higher risk and certificated category. Now, in terms of growing use cases, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I know that you have daily information about the expanding use cases of unmanned aviation. A few market figures here. In Europe, for instance, the total markets for unmanned aviation has been forecasted around 10 billion euros for 2035, growing to 15 billion euro in 2050. Total sales of civilian unmanned aircraft estimated to $5 billion in 2021. We also have jobs that are expected to be created through not only the sales and manufacture of aircraft and the services, but also through indirect activities. 100,000 jobs estimated 2025. And for the segment referred to as eVTOL, so electric vertical takeoff and landing, the estimates are also quite promising, with 10 to 20 billion US dollars in 2030, and that includes both the aircraft themselves, the infrastructure, as well as the services that are enabled through these activities. So, first activity that is served by these aircraft is, of course, transport. So transports in the traditional sense, involving moving people or cargo from one point to the other. In this category are expected business models such as parcels delivery, especially in urban and suburban environment, as well as in due course the transport of passengers through the so-called activities of flying taxis whenever the regulatory conditions are met. There's a second activity apart from transport, a range of activities actually, which is based on the ability that these aircraft give to see the Earth from above and to collect extremely valuable information in a much more cost-effective way and safer way than traditional aviation activities. And that is referred to as all the data collection activities such as mapping, monitoring of infrastructure, power lines, survey, building inspection, wind turbines, and so on and so forth. The list is growing constantly, and the activities here are actually extremely promising because they also have induced economic effects. Once the data is collected, significant resources and technologies are needed to process the data and to make it usable for specific economic activities. So there is a tremendous potential in this area. Agriculture is also a domain where unmanned aircraft are increasingly used. One example is the ability that they give to monitor crops, for instance, and identify areas that need specific treatment. There are significant activities going on for precision agriculture, and particularly in developing countries. So these are the main activities. There are several others. These activities bring significant cost advantages. Why? Because traditional ways to do these different activities typically required, let's say, the purchase of a small piston engine aircraft. Well, the cost of such a purchase is minimum $50,000. The cost of training is also significant for to become a commercial pilot and hold a license. In Europe, for instance, it's hard to imagine obtaining it below 30,000 euros. Well, for both the equipment and the training, the costs can be divided by 10 easily. So there are significant cost advantages associated to using unmanned aircraft. Now the challenges. Can be grouped in three categories. We're going to talk first about regulation and governance as largely intended. A first aspect of this is, and here this is not exhaustive, not intended to be detailed, but just a few things that I found relevant to flag. Categorization of unmanned aircraft. The traditional framework, the way to regulate aviation has been since its inception based on specific criteria. For instance, the distinction between commercial air transport and not commercial air transport, including general aviation, and based on a segmentation by weight. Now, for unmanned aviation, this segmentation is not relevant because these aircraft are usually smaller, do not have the same weight, and the risk associated to the operations is not based on the number of passengers that are carried on board, because typically there are no passengers on board, at least on the outset. Plus, there could be activities that generate more risk. For instance, the use of small unmanned aircraft in urban environments over people, that generates a risk to the persons on the ground, and therefore it's not related to the weight or the size of aircraft. So instead, the consensus internationally is to have a operation-centric and risk-based approach to regulating unmanned aviation. So just in a nutshell, there are three categories, and the top category, the certificated category, is intended to be regulated in a way similar to manned aviation, which means having licensed pilots, having certificated aircraft, and approved operators with safety management system and the whole regulatory framework that goes with it. On the lower end, what is referred to as the open category, that includes recreational uses of drones as well as simple applications. The intent is to have these not subjected to prior authorization, but subject to instead operational restrictions such as flight during daytime and visual line of sight flying, non-proximity to sensitive sites such as aerodromes, and so on and so forth. So in between is what is called the specific category, where the operations would be authorized throughout a thorough risk assessment by the authority. So that's a fundamental distinction and a paradigm shift. Another aspect where unmanned aviation can be at odds with the current traditional framework is the flight rules. As you all are aviators, from day one, we are told that there are either visual flight rules or instrument flight rules. Well, as part of these flight rules, for instance, you're not supposed to fly below a certain altitude, for instance, in VFR 500 feet above ground level. Well, how do you reconcile this requirement for business models that are actually expected to have unmanned aircraft flying close to the ground or close to buildings? right-of-way rules, for instance, proximity to clouds. These are part of flight rules, and considerable work will be needed to make sure that solutions are found to accommodate this framework to these new activities. Another aspect that is important is the impact of automation and autonomy. With the expansion of technology, automation is increasing, and particularly in unmanned aviation. There are new activities taking place where the roles of the pilots are changing significantly. And what is important is to ensure that there is still one person that is responsible for the conduct of the flight from departure to the end. That also will need to be addressed and considered. Just moving on to the other challenges, there's also the distinction between good and bad unmanned aircraft. There has been a significant increase in unauthorized presence of unmanned aircraft, and some of these high profile that have generated considerable safety risks as well as economic costs, making sure that no either reckless use or malicious uses of unmanned aircraft happen is a key concern. Different technologies are being developed to counter these effects. One key requirement is to ensure that when, for instance, disrupting the operation of these unauthorized aircraft, no unintended interference is caused to either navigational equipment of manned aircraft or to air traffic control equipment or even airport systems. Another aspect is the regulation regarding dangerous goods, the carriage of dangerous goods. That is something that may not necessarily come immediately to mind, but there are, as you all know, specific ICAO standards and technical instructions regarding the transportation of dangerous goods. There are increasing use cases for the transport of, for instance, medical supplies or medical samples, including infectious substances. Well, these need to be considered in the framework of dangerous goods activities. Even facilitation, the entry and exit of cargo when cargo activities reach a sufficient maturity through unmanned aircraft will need to be considered. Traffic rights, which is an area that right now the exchange of traffic rights is granted through a specific provision of the Chicago Convention. With the expected increase of activities and when significant volumes can be created, thought will have to be given, and even before that, to perhaps adapting the regulatory framework for the exchange of traffic rights between different states. Another emerging challenge is definitely infrastructure. We've covered some of the regulatory challenges, but now infrastructure. The first aspect is creating surfaces, operating sites. So that especially applies to the so-called flying taxis and urban air mobility activities. Dedicated operating sites will have to be created, obviously, and they will have to be equipped with recharging facilities, for instance, perhaps also hard infrastructure to welcome and to keep passengers before embarking. There is an aspect of planning also that goes beyond that, how to integrate these sites within the whole transportation system, how to ensure a seamless intermodal integration. That's something that will require considerable thinking and coordination, including with local authorities, and there's a lot of activities going on in that area. Now, the item also of how to build and how to finance the infrastructure will have to be considered. whether the infrastructure is fully private or is financed through different sources involving governments, whether and to what level should there be cooperation between the public and the private sector to efficiently ensure that these business models can not only be profitable but also serve general needs of societies. And also, another key aspect is how to safely organize the traffic. There's a concept of UTM, Unmanned Aircraft Systems Traffic Management, for which ICAO is developing a guidance material through the UAS advisory group. And the important thing here is to ensure that services, fundamental services such as registration, identification, flight planning, pre-flight information such as weather, NOTAMs, as well as deconfliction, rerouting can be ensured in an efficient way and with an efficient interface with the existing ATM system. Acceptance is a key factor also. Of course, safety comes first, and for societies to accept these technologies, demonstration will have to be made that these technologies are safe. That is the absolute prerequisite. Another aspect is the sound element, especially in urban and suburban environment. More than interestingly, the volume of sound, the type of sound, and particularly the high pitch of aircraft, especially during the takeoff and landing phases, is of concern, as well as visual annoyance. And related to that are privacy concerns. ICAO is working traditionally on the left field. You can see here the red box covers the activities of ICAO for the development of standards and recommended practices through the RPAS panel for the international IFR operations. And that activity is funded in ICAO. Now, there are other activities, including the development of guidance material for UAS, as well as the core principles for the UTM, as well as guidance for humanitarian aid and emergency response. These other activities are not funded. What's next? Well, I want to mention the third Drone-Enabled Symposium that is taking place here in Montreal, 12 to 14 November, which will bring together industry and regulators to brainstorm on unmanned aviation regulation and operations. The work of the panel for the ICAO SARPs will continue in different areas, including licensing, airworthiness, operations, detect and avoid, C2 link, ATM, amongst others. Humanitarian aid and emergency activities continue. And I want to mention also to support states in regulating these activities that ICAO is developing a course on the fundamentals of unmanned aviation, which is expected to be made available in next year, in 2020. So just to a little wrap up here, what is very important to remember is that unmanned aircraft are indeed aircraft, including so-called drones and flying taxis. These are aircraft, and the regulatory framework that comes with aircraft through the Chicago Convention applies to these activities. These activities, as we have seen, are on the rise. There's no question about that. However, safety comes first, and in order for these activities to be widely accepted, the safety case will have to be made very robustly. In order to do that, in the coming years, it would be essential that an ongoing dialogue between regulators and industry take place to make sure that the needs of this growing industry are taken into account in an agile way. And ICAO will continue to work on these efforts and to find the most adequate solutions. That concludes my presentation. The email where you can find, you can ask questions or ask for information is on the screen here. I'm happy to take questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. If anybody has any questions, I would invite you to come up to the mic. Please. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you very much for your presentation, which was very insightful. My question is, drones have come to live. We have to, unfortunately, live with them. And it's a growing industry with exponential growth. My proposal is that should the aviation community be involved with all aspects of drones, or should the aviation industry be only concerned about drones that infringe into operations of aircraft and the aviation industry itself?
Thank you very much, sir. That's a very good question. I think that's just my personal take on that. But the aviation community as a whole should be concerned with everything that potentially affects safety, security, or environmental sustainability, and to ensure that the potential for these activities to generate new businesses is fulfilled and is met in a safe way. So as you said, the infringement aspect is essential. It is absolutely key to work together to ensure that there are no unintended consequences, and that some instances where unauthorized drones close to airports, for instance, or some very close calls do not repeat again. And for that, very strong and robust cooperation with key stakeholders is needed. For instance, first of all, pilots, operators, who are in direct contact and can witness these unauthorized presence of unmanned aircraft. Then air traffic controllers, airport operators, and then law enforcement authorities. I think that is the community that needs to be involved to ensure that these activities take place safely and without unintended consequences. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My questions are stemming out of a recent conference we had in England on unmanned drones. Looking at the developments taking place, up to now they are working on 25 payload drones. So as the person who is in charge of running airports in Sri Lanka, it's a frightening situation, because when we went for the conference, we were looking at a silver bullet to solve the problem, and there was none there. So our request to the manufacturers were to come out with some regulatory framework within themselves, so that they keep a track of who is manufacturing. But they're faced with a situation where there are guys who are manufacturing drones in their backyard. So I think when it comes to protecting airports, the aircrafts that are coming in and taking off, I think it's a serious concern. So can ICAO initiate discussions with these groups and as a community and come out with, I think there should be a dialogue between both parties to come out with regulatory frameworks, at the same time legislative frameworks, because I think there should be legislative frameworks also for violations. At this point, I don't think we are addressing that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for the excellent question. Indeed, as you're pointing out, some people manufacture equipment in their backyards. These persons are not familiar with necessarily with the safety culture that prevails in aviation and has served us so well so far. So that is a significant concern, and different initiatives are taking place in different countries to ensure that the information spreads out including to the public who either purchases or manufactures unmanned aircraft by themselves, to give the message that what you're doing is aviation and you are subject to aviation rules. So how to spread the word and how to mutualize the information? Well, I want to point out again that ICAO is holding a yearly event called Drone Enable. The next one is taking place, as I said, in November, 12th to 14th November 2019 in Montreal. And that is the forum where regulators and industry can share views on how to regulate these aspects and come up with solutions that both enable these activities but ensure that safety is guaranteed. And I would add also that there is a twist to that, is that what is involved here is essentially domestic activities, while ICAO's mandate is international navigation. But in spite of that, the work that ICAO is doing through the advisory group, the UAS advisory group, as well as Drone Enable, and also through the RPAS panel, contributes to these efforts. So save the date, and I hope to see you at Drone Enable in November. Thank you, sir.
Okay, we'll take one last question.
Good morning. I'm aware that ICAO is coming up with some amendments to Annex 8, as well as coming up with a new Annex 6 Part 4 to cover drones. But what is the take on amending Annex 7? Because under the definition, they are aircraft, they need to be registered, and there is some standards relating to having a registration mark on the machine itself. So it will not be possible for smaller machines to have the same kind of identification, while the bigger machines would be able to, even for the identification plate to be put on the equipment. It may be more than the weight of the drone itself in some cases. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for the good questions. Yes, you're right. ICAO is working on provisions and is currently developing an Annex 6 Part 4 for operations, and has actually sent out for state consultation standards and recommended practices for airworthiness. So for the segment of unmanned aviation that corresponds to international IFR operations, the full regulatory framework of the Chicago Convention applies, including Annex 7 registration. Now, I think your question is particularly relevant in the context of a smaller UAS, where the weight factor is particularly significant. And this aspect of registration is extremely important. There is work going on in ICAO on that. Tied into this aspect is also the need for a remote identification in order to ensure that specific unmanned aircraft can be properly tracked and identified. So there is a lot going on in ICAO in different groups on that, and there will be developments coming up on these aspects pretty soon. Again, I encourage you strongly to participate to the Drone Enable Symposium, where these topics will be discussed with a dialogue between the industry and regulators to facilitate the emergence of best solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Frédéric Malaud.
My pleasure. Thanks.